Well, it is great to be with you again, whether you are in your small group gathering over Zoom, or maybe in one of our locations, maybe even in a home, or maybe you're with your family, a roommate, and just following through the sermon series, or maybe you're following through just on your own in your own devotional life as we navigate together what God has for us from the Gospel of Matthew. It's an amazing gospel. And what's so amazing about it is how often, as we've seen, Matthew quotes the Old Testament, and specifically the Old Testament prophets. And what I want to encourage you to consider this year, because we'll be in Matthew's Gospel for quite some time, maybe consider as a group or as an individual reading the Old Testament prophets. Read the book of Isaiah if you've never read it before. It's long, it's 68 chapters. Read the book of Micah. It's short, it's 7 chapters. Read Hosea. It's a little bit longer, it's 11 chapters. Read Jeremiah. It's long, 52 chapters, but what you will see is you will begin to see what Matthew saw. All of the parallels and all of the connections to Jesus Christ. Not just in his genealogy and his birth, but his life, his death, and resurrection. And it pointing to him as the one that all of the prophets spoke about, and all that Jesus did to fulfill all the law and the prophets, and therefore prove that he is the one. So I want to encourage you, maybe as a group, to challenge one another and just walk through all of those Old Testament books. But for today's purposes, tonight, or whatever time you're viewing this as a group or as an individual, the summary of the sermon on Sunday, you'll remember that the storyline in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2, is Herod had made a decree that every child, every boy under the age of 2 would be murdered, and this caused Joseph and Mary to flee down to Egypt, and then there was great weeping in Bethlehem because by the mothers and even the fathers who saw their kids being murdered by Herod. And what Matthew does is, as Joseph and Mary go down to Egypt with Jesus, Matthew makes the connection to Hosea, chapter 11. Out of Egypt I have called my son. And what Matthew is doing is referring to Hosea and the context there in which God's people had prostituted themselves, and Hosea had taken a wife as a prostitute to demonstrate or to illustrate what God's people were doing to God. And God refers to Israel as a child, as their son who was brought up out of Egypt, and delivered them from oppression and sin and harm, and was going to be their husband, and they were going to be his wife. They were going to be joined in a marriage, as it were. But Israel was not true to the covenant, to their side of the covenant. They rebelled against God in every way, from Moses all the way through Hosea. And so what Matthew does is say, out of Egypt, God has called my son. And so he's paralleling the son that is Israel, that was Israel coming out of Egypt, with the son that is Jesus. And Jesus, Matthew is describing him as the true Israel, the one who did what Old Testament Israel never did. Jesus fulfilled the covenant. He fulfilled the law and the prophets. And he came out of Egypt and did exactly what Israel was supposed to do. And Matthew wants them to see this. And then in Jeremiah, the context is Jeremiah, he was the last prophet to speak to the northern tribe of Israel before they were taken captive. And God's people, as they're led out through Ramah, which is a place in the northern part of northern border of Israel, of northern kingdom of Israel and southern kingdom of Israel, or of Judah, as they're being led through Ramah, they're weeping and lamenting loudly. And their voice is loud. And Rachel, who is a reference to Israel or her children were a reference to Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. She's weeping for her children. And what Matthew does is pick that up again and say, yes, that happened. But great hope of deliverance has now come that the prophet Jeremiah also spoke about. Jesus is the true Israel. He is the representative of God's people who will die for their sin, that their joy may be, or their mourning may be turned to joy, and their sorrow to gladness. That's what Matthew is doing when he's quoting these prophets, Hosea and Jeremiah. And he does this to encourage you and me in our faith, to know that our faith has a firm foundation, that it's not blind faith, and to encourage us, therefore, to go into the world and proclaim that Jesus is the one. He is the Messiah. He's the King. And to make disciples of all the nations so that they too would be blessed by believing in this King. I hope you enjoy your study together, and I hope you're enjoying this series in Matthew. And I know some of it will go over, it might be going over your heads, but it's gone over in many cases, my own head. But as we continue to navigate it, we will continue to snap these pieces together that Matthew is intending for us, so that we're firm in our faith and make disciples. God bless you all. Love you. Have a great time together.